I got started in education relatively early on. I wanted to be a math, physics, and computer science teacher when I was still living in Germany. And I actually went through the teacher training. And at the time, which is I think still the case, you need a master's degree in the subjects that you want to teach. And so I was getting a master's degree in maths, physics, and added computer science to that in my later years at college. And I started very early on to work with a physics professor who did experiments in the lab for students, with students, that were the classic physics experiment, optics, electronics, etc. And he asked me to use computers, which were pretty new at the time, to take the measurement from those experiments and visualize them. And I had gone through the labs myself, and I had done it in a notebook, and I saw how tedious it was and how error prone it was and how hard it was to really focus on the outcomes rather than on the mechanics of jotting down all the measurements. And from that moment on, I was fascinated by the power of computers to visualize the things that are sometimes so hard for us to imagine, to visualize those more abstract things for which we really have no context to imagine them ourselves. So unlike poetry or literature, where we sometimes don't want it to be visualized, we want this to do that ourselves. In the sciences, it is often very hard to do, especially when it becomes 3D visualizations, etc. So that's what I started with very early on. I started programming computers to do visualizations. And later, when it became time to think about a career, decided to get a PhD in educational technologies because it was just such a fascinating topic to me. How can we help people learn? How can we help people make sense of the world around them using technologies that can kind of augment what the power of the human cognitive architecture is and add to it and help us? Because we surely need help. There is more and more information available every day. We need to process that information in faster and faster times to come up with responses. And we need help, right? And so we see that in learning, we see that in schools, we see that in the job place, in the workplace these days. People need this help. And so my question has become then, how can we design effective technologies for learning? What is the right technology for the right learning objective, for the right learning need? And how does it need to be designed so that it's effective? Just because we design a particular technology doesn't mean it is effective and meets its goals. So what are those design factors that make them effective? And over the years, I've studied multimedia learning. And for multimedia learning, what was exciting is that we would use visual and auditory information and present information that way and help people to learn and combine it with textual information. Then we got interested in interactivity. How would an interactive multimedia environment facilitate learning? So now it was adding the doing component, not just the receiving and processing information component. And then we started a line of research that was on emotional design, where we realized it wasn't just about processing information as a cognition, but it was also about how we feel when we do that, what the feeling is that a learner has, and not just math anxiety or those kind of negative feelings, but what would positive feelings do for us? So when you add highly visual, highly interactive, and emotional, you actually get games. And so I started studying games, designing and studying games for some time, and investigating the educational power and effectiveness of games. And that has led us to design our own game store in the App Store and on Google Play that are cognitive skills training games. And so we're asking questions around effective game design when it comes to games for learning. And then finally, I got interested in what would it look like if we were fully immersed in a visual space in which we can interact and talk to others and learn about things. And that is the whole power of virtual reality. And so our latest research has focused on virtual reality, on the design of virtual reality environments that are interactive and that are collaborative, and whether we can use them or how we can use them for science learning, and how middle schoolers perhaps can learn about how an animal cell or plant cell is created, or what components, what organelles it consists of, by building one themselves, or learn about viruses and learn about protein synthesis. So those are the topics and questions that fascinate me. It's always about why pick a particular technology for learning, and how can we design that technology so it is effective for learning. Yeah, perceptions of policymakers and school leaders have slowly changed to embrace technology as a tool for learning where there is a place for them in school. That was initially not easy to convince leaders to do that. It was a new technology. It wasn't proven yet. But over the years, we have seen, at least in a number of studies, not in all of them, that there is an effective, that there are effective outcomes of technology for learning. And now the conversation has shifted more to how do we train our teachers and what kind of content do we provide for our students. And here we realize that it is not enough to just offer a technology to schools and say, here's a great simulation to learn about science, go ahead and use it. Schools and teachers are often very willing to do that. But to integrate a technology into a classroom, into a curriculum, it takes more than just having that technology available. So we've been focusing a lot on what are teachers' needs to get dashboards, to understand what even happens in that technology, to integrate it into their lesson plans, to have tools that allow them to, for instance, have students write a report. If everything is digital, how are they going to write a report about what they're doing? So maybe if you're in virtual reality, there is a camera tool that you can take pictures in VR of what you designed, and then you can write your report about that and submit that the traditional way, meaning electronically now, of course. So the conversation has shifted away from, is it desirable to have technology in schools, to now that we have technology, and many schools here in the United States have at least some technology access, what do we do with it? And how do we train our teachers? And how do we integrate it into the classroom for it to be effective? And so if I were to advise school leaders, is to look for, or have their staff look for, the kind of research studies that show that technology is effective for learning. And as a researcher, very selfishly, I would ask them to also allow research in their schools to show that technology is effective for learning, because that research has to come from somewhere. And if we collaborate with schools to provide that kind of research, then we both win. We find out which technologies are effective, and we can disseminate that, and others can build new technology and their own technology based on the research results that we can provide. The question, what considerations to base the design of digital technologies, or really any learning environments, on, is a very important one, and really reflects our way of thinking about how people learn. And we initially thought, we don't need to know what happens in the brain. All we need to do is, if we give you a stimulus and you respond the way we want you to, we give you a reward for that. And if you don't respond the right way, we give you a punishment for that. And that was called behaviorism. And that actually still works to some extent. We have cognitive behavioral therapy. We have that kind of learning for simple facts, vocabulary, etc. But we've long come around to understand that if we understand the brain and how it functions, we have a much better chance of designing effective tools for learning. And the brain functions would be memory and cognition, it would be attention and perception. And so if we understand that, we can design the kind of multimedia learning environments, virtual reality environments that facilitate learning. However, we have then realized that learning isn't just a process of information processing. It's not just taking in information, processing that, and trying to commit it to memory and later retrieve it. Learning is actually a social process, inherently social. Learning is an emotional process, and emotion and cognition cannot be separated. So a pure cognitive science perspective of learning is, of course, important, but needs to be augmented by learning sciences, which also looks at teacher context, school contexts, cultural context and cultural variables, social variables, motivational variables, affect and emotion. All of those need to be considered. And some technology solutions are mostly designed to address motivation, right? To get students to even engage with a particular topic in the first place. And so for me, it is very important to take that comprehensive perspective of what learning is. Learners in context, situated, meaning-making as a meaning-making process rather than a memorization process. And it is so important because that is what the workplace now looks like. We don't want people who have memorized things and then they show up in the workplace. We want problem solvers, communicators, people who are creative, who can collaborate, and can work in teams to solve the important problems of society. And for that, we need that comprehensive view of learning. And that is what a combination of cognitive science and learning sciences provides. The one thing that we have learned over the years of designing technology is that an initial question by educators, parents, teachers is, are we replacing the teachers? And if there's one thing we have learned is that the role of the teacher might be changing, but it is as important as ever, if not more important. And teachers used to be the holders of the information that was then given to the students. Now they become the facilitators of the learning process. They help students select the right problems. They help students select the right technology. They help when kids are stuck. They help the especially gifted or those who have fallen behind for various reasons. Teachers will always have a function in the learning process. And the technologies we design help them be more effective. The technologies we think of, even the virtual reality technologies, virtual reality environments, really aim to help the teachers. And so we often, when we, for instance, we designed a technology on virtual reality simulation on building plant cells, animal cells, prokaryotic cells, etc., mitosis. We didn't design that to replace the teacher in the classroom and students would only be in the simulation. Instead, what we did is we designed a classroom integration, curricular integration, where the teacher initially works with the students to identify what the organelles of a cell are. And that is their assignment. They need to learn about the organelles in a cell. They need to prepare that for the next class. And when they come to that next class, then they get a virtual environment where they are asked to build their own cell. But they prepared that with the teacher. Now they build their own cell in the environment. They take photos of that. They interact with that. They collaborate with the other students on that. The environment gives them some feedback, but then they write a report on that, and that's what they hand in to the teacher. So to us, that is a classic way of integrating technology for only those parts of the learning process where it is useful. And for the other parts, we use other media. The notion that one medium would be the only medium in which we will learn is one that certainly learning scientists have long abandoned, and where we say, no, it is a combination of media. Each of them have their strengths. Each of them have their weaknesses. We call that affordances of media, and that's what my talk will be all about. And we need to pick the right medium for the right instructional goals, settings, students, and contexts. And that is at the heart of the learning design process, learning experience design process. And that is what my passion is, to teach and to implement in my own work. And when we do that, then we realize the teacher will always have a role. Parents need to have a role in learning. We as parents cannot just say, oh, students learn in school and we don't have to worry about that. And society has to take a role in learning, because this is the next generation. This is the generation that is supposed to solve all the problems that we had such a hard time solving. And so when you look at it that way, then a virtual environment in which students interact with teachers should just facilitate that process rather than replace it with something entirely different. It should allow those students who live remotely in some rural area and don't have access to certain courses, it should allow them to participate in those courses. It should open up opportunities rather than limit the interactions that they otherwise might have with a real teacher. So for us, it is always, the question is always, how can we include more equitable options for learners? How can we be more inclusive? How can we create environments where the diversity is what actually enhances them? You know, when you learn with students from all around the world, or from when urban students learn with rural students, and when they share experiences, that is the kind of power of remote learning and learning in virtual environments that enhances their effectiveness. So we are very much concerned about making sure it is a positive change that we're affecting by designing virtual environments. And I think that is what industry, tech industry, has as a responsibility to do the same. And we hope that that's going to happen in the design of those new learning environments that are coming in the very near future. When we think about the effective integration of technology in schools, we need to recognize that schools are very complex systems. And like in any complex system, if I just try to make one change, it will have ripple effects in the system that are hard to predict and often have unforeseen consequences. Or likewise, I will see that if I try to make changes just in one part of the system, the rest of the system might not respond in the way that we expect it to be, and might not be as supportive as we thought it would be. So when it comes to schools and teachers, if we wanted to integrate new technologies, we need to have a technology infrastructure. It can't be upon the teacher to be both the teacher and the IT support person. So we need to have the technology infrastructure of maintaining and setting up the equipment. We need to have a school leadership that is supportive of that. We need to have teachers that are actually trained in the use of technology. We need to have curricula that are designed in a way that technology actually has a role in those curricula rather than being an add-on that we do when we have a little bit of extra time. We need to convince parents that this technology is actually something that is positive for their children, because parents are very concerned about change. In fact, sometimes parents are the most conservative part of the learning process in schools. And so when we think about all of that together, and then finally, we need to make students actually master the technology. And often when we use technology for the very first time, there's a learning process involved. How do we use the technology? How do we interact with it? This is often opening up entirely new ways of learning, problem solving, project-based learning. And when students are not used to that, then the first few times of using a technology can sometimes be very disruptive and not effective at all. And so that's why we need to think of it as a system, and a system that changes slowly, where the first few times you do something new, it might not work out, and where you need to persist. And that is very hard in schools, because schools are the kind of environments where students then go home and say to the parents, oh, today was a big mess. We tried technology and it didn't work out. And then everybody gets discouraged and stops trying. So taking all of those factors together, we haven't even talked about effective design of the environment itself, right? We assume that that's what is available. So that is the part of that system that we mostly are focused with. How can we make sure that the learning experience itself then is designed well? And in order to design for schools, we need to understand the context of schools. So any edtech company who designs a learning tool and says, we have a learning tool, now we want to sell it to schools, has to first do research with schools and do a needs assessment. How would a school and a teacher in a classroom use this technology? What is the infrastructure that's available? And all of those questions that would then allow schools to successfully integrate that technology into their classroom. So there's much more to it than just the learning experience. And we need to consider all these other factors for that technology to be effective. And as a result, because many solutions do not have that, adoption of some technologies is very slow, even though we say, well, we know this is effective for learning, but that's only part of the coin, part of the problem. The other part is, how does it actually get successfully integrated? And one thing that needs to change here in the United States, most states which have their own teacher certification have very minimal requirements for technology training for teachers. It just is assumed that it is part of the subject matter training, of the pedagogy training, but often it is not. And so teachers who are not prepared to use technology are much more reluctant to use it in the classroom. And so we need to think about reforming teacher education programs. So now we're going from reforming schools to reforming teacher education programs, which is another completely different system that needs to be addressed. So it becomes very complex to bring about the right circumstances for the integration of technology in schools, which is why change is much slower than in other sectors of the industry. So at EDUtech Europe this year, I will be talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality for learning. And I will focus on two aspects of that. One is, what are the affordances of those environments? We always talk about the power of AR, VR, XR, MR. And what we sometimes don't talk about is, what are the specific affordances, the specific capabilities of those media for learning, and how can we take advantage of those? And so my talk will focus on what those are for virtual reality, which are very different from augmented reality, and what mixed reality learning environments might look like, and how we can separate those and decide which one is actually the best one for learning of a particular topic, of a particular subject matter for certain context and certain students. And then the second part will turn to, once we chose a medium for its affordances, what are design factors, design consideration within the medium that make them more effective for learning. And here we're going to talk about evidence-based design principles to inform the design of those learning environments. And because they're at an early stage, I'm going to draw parallels from multimedia and simulations and games. And we will talk about emotional design, interaction design, and collaboration design, amongst others, and how to do that right, and what the research says about them in the context of augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality.